Okay, so I've been going back and forth for a few months now, debating whether I should make a video talking about this show. I actually have started on a few drafts, but I just never got around to fully finishing them as other things would take my attention. But after recently marathoning the first season after having not seen it for a bit, I decided, why not? Cause I do think this series deserves some attention. This is going to be more of a casual video in the vein of my old Scott Pilgrim Takes Off video from way back then, with minimal editing and hopefully being under 15 minutes. But you know, sometimes I can't help myself. So yeah, as the title implies, Cartoon Network released a new original series all the way back in November, and there's a pretty decent chance you may have never heard of this show before. Why is that? Well, I'll get to that later. But anyway, the premise. Invincible Fight Girl, which I'm now going to abbreviate as IFG because I'm not going to say that name all the time, is about a young girl named Andy whose goal is to become the best wrestler of all time. This is not only because of her childhood experiences watching wrestling for the first time, but also because the world she lives in is all about wrestling. It's a literal lifestyle. But there's one problem. Andy isn't a real wrestler, and she also isn't very good, at least starting out. She's just an accountant who's from a family of accountants living on an island of accountants who also happen to fear wrestlers, which is obviously an issue. So the first season is basically Andy's journey to achieve her dream while also navigating her world and its many issues. An aspect of IFG I do appreciate is its world building. While not the most original idea of all time, I do think the creative team did a good job of building intrigue into the wrestling world, and its rules and functions. It's very much implied that there is a caste system within this society, and certain types of people are given labels and are expected to do certain things. The idea that Andy is an accountant who has dreams of becoming a wrestler is shocking to a lot of people in the show because accountants in this society are just not meant to be that. They're just meant to work behind the scenes doing the world's finances and nothing else. Then there's the concept of a buster, which is given to wrestlers who try to climb the ranks and risk everything, but end up failing and giving up. And while this may seem like a blow to any wrestler's ego, some busters actually turn it into a positive, building a new life from their failures and inspiring others. And lastly, the food vendors in the Rusty Rumble, whose technique helps make food like meat taste a lot better, they can also use those skills in the ring and go on to become wrestlers. While it's a lifestyle with some wiggle room, they're still boxed into a specific task they're expected to do, which is explored a little with the Beef Puncher family when the story temporarily focuses on them. And that's another thing. A common sentiment espoused by some of the characters is that strength and prowess is the only thing that truly matters in this world, with some wrestlers even going as far to see themselves as gods to be worshipped. And the story does explore this mindset and how toxic it can obviously be. Like with Mikey, one of the main characters in this family, and later on with this cowboy couple, and how after their winning streak was broken, they just never got over it and it tore an entire town apart. While that might be stuff you have seen before, I think it's still done well despite that. And I can say the same thing about Andy's character. Andy is genuinely a likable protagonist, having a lot of traits you see in a lot of shonen protagonists, like being very kind-hearted, having a dream, the works. If you know Deku from My Hero Academia, yeah, it's some of that energy. But she does have a little bit of nuance in her personality. She can be very cocky from time to time and can be very aggressive when she needs to. Especially when it comes to Craig, and he usually deserves it. And I like how the show does challenge her worldview. How she starts the series off with this complete adoration of wrestling, but throughout the season we see that get tested multiple times. One of the tenets of Andy's character is that she not only fights for what she believes in, but she's completely willing to do the same for others. Like with Mikey in episode 3 and 4, as his situation parallels Andy in various ways. Wanting to achieve your dreams, but your current circumstances just won't let you. Now in that situation, Andy ended up getting her way as Mikey leaves his family in order to help her. But in episodes 6 and 7, when Andy decides to help this girl named Birdie solve her issues, it doesn't go as planned and things go south very quickly. And the fallout of the conflict being worse than it initially was, with Andy coming to the harsh reality that some people can't be helped and are just a lost cause. And that's just a Cliff Notes version of that two-parter, cause a lot of stuff goes down in those episodes and I personally would want you to see it for yourself. Episode 7 is generally, in my opinion, a great episode and one of the best the season has to offer. But yeah, I really liked what they did with Andy as a character, and her overall growth by the end of the season was really satisfying to watch. And on the topic of watching, this show from an art perspective looks great. In terms of the character design specifically, it really does feel like an evolution of the Cartoon Network style they've been doing for the past few years, in shows like Villainous, We Bare Bears, and OKKO. Also Wakfu. Yeah, it's not a Cartoon Network show, but the style does remind me of that too. I wouldn't blame a person thinking this show was French. The background characters in this show give me massive OKKO vibes and how weird and nonsensical they can be at times. The characters in general have more defined anatomy and detail when it comes down to their designs. And when I say detail, I really mean it. Even in screenshots which I've been using for this video, the show looks really good. The individual drawings majority of the time are just really crisp, fitting well for a series that has gritty but also highly fantastical fights. Which also leads into the show's animation. Now I dropped the word shonen a few times when I was describing Andy's character, and that was for a reason. IFG is very clearly inspired by anime, especially shonen anime. And this isn't a surprise, especially if you look at the interviews with the creator. They make their influences very clear. I mean, the world of IFG is very similar to My Hero Academia and Kinnikuman, or as we know it in English-speaking countries, Ultimate Muscle. Especially that last one, since that is another fantastical series that focuses on wrestling. But going back to the animation, it's very clearly taking cues from the limited approach TV anime mostly employs. Relying on a limited number of drawings, holding on specific drawings for dramatic effect. The show also has a lot of anime expressions and also chibis, and how the characters sometimes move from pose to pose with tight spacing rather than having any in-betweens. You can tell the team was very much inspired by Studio Trigger and how they tend to approach animation. Even though IFG is not the first cartoon in recent memory to be inspired by Trigger, or even its father studio, Gainax. It's funny how the style is not only an homage, but can also be seen as a cost-saving measure on the animation front. The same way it's done in anime. But when the show does have an action scene, it tries to commit as much as it can with the resources it has, and the results aren't too shabby. There was a weird bit of drama on Twitter when the 4th episode dropped. One part of the fight went a little viral and some people came in and started complaining about how mid the animation looked or whatever, if I remember. I think even some of the creative staff of the show got involved, and honestly, I don't care. I mean, it's Twitter, what do you expect? These are probably the same people saying Sakamoto Days has bad animation. Like, come on. Now I can kind of see where people are coming from when they say the anime references feel very surface level and all that, but for me personally, I didn't really mind it much. The fight scenes aren't on the same level as something like Rise of the TMNT or any Flying Bark series. You're not gonna get some Yutaka Nakamura level stuff in this series, you know, Tom Barkle coming in, putting out some fire stuff. This show doesn't have many Sakuga moments, but occasionally there were a few points where I was like, okay, that was actually kinda cool. This season actually had 2 studios working on it. NE4U, which did most of the episodes, by the way, they're the same studio that animates Invincible, but episodes 4, 7, and 9 were animated by Titmouse. And honestly, their episodes are some of the best looking episodes of the series, bar none. Which isn't surprising since this is the studio that worked on Tales of the TMNT and Super Jail and other shows, so I expect nothing less. Though their episodes honestly make me wish that they did all the animation for the show, full stop. Now, before I close this out, I want to talk about some of my minor gripes with the show. Not a whole lot of them, but they're worth mentioning. Outside of Andy, I haven't really talked about much of the characters. That's because a lot of them didn't really leave much of an impression on me. Now, this isn't to say that the characters like Mikey and Craig are bad characters. It's that at this point in the story, I'm not invested in either of them or their potential future arcs. Episode 5 does try to do something with the both of them, and it's essentially their episode, and it's a fine episode and all, but I really didn't come out of it being like, yeah, I really like these guys now. Hell, I actually don't think I even described what both their deals are. I did touch on Mikey's backstory a little bit. One of his main conflicts is that unlike his brothers, he actually doesn't want to be a wrestler, but instead wants to become a wrestling journalist. Also, due to him being very observant in his youth, he knows a lot about strategy and weakness in specific wrestling styles. I do love the fact that he and his brothers are actually around like 8 or 10 years old, despite them looking like roided out Giga Chads. That's actually really funny. But yeah, his character has a lot of potential, but in this season, he's just alright. And I say the same for Craig, who most of his shtick is that he's essentially a con artist. And initially, he only sees Andy as a sucker to make money off of, but he does come around to actually caring about her well-being. Again, like Mikey, he's fine, but not really interesting. Though his voice actor, Paul Castro Jr., does a great job of selling his youngblood sleazy nature. And if that name sounds familiar, he played Mini Vegeta in the English dub of Dragon Ball Daima. You know, you learn something new every day. That does remind me to give mention to the voice actors, who all did a fantastic job here. I'll admit a decent amount of these voices I'm not familiar with, but they do have some standouts like Clancy Brown as Mikey's dad, or Keith freaking David as the narrator and also a side character near the end of the season. We'll never get tired of his voice. But getting back on track, lastly there's Queso Poblano or Aunt P, who I haven't even referenced at all up to this point despite her being a pretty pivotal character in the series' lore and in Andy's journey. She's the whole reason why Andy even wanted to pursue wrestling in the first place, But the issue that she runs into is that in the current day, she's retired and also hates wrestling, and doesn't really want to get involved in Andy's shenanigans. She basically plays the burned out mentor character. Think Luke Skywalker from The Last Jedi or even Peter B. Parker from the first Spider-Verse. For most of the series, she sits on the sidelines occasionally commenting on what's going on. Now, with how Season 1's story is laid out and how it progresses, I can understand the decision to make her present self not as prevalent compared to her past selves, which is done for story purposes. And I like how by the end of the season, she finally decides to train Andy, but it's for completely reactive reasons rather than doing it out of the kindness of her heart. Which does fit her character. It's very clear that she's going to be an ever-evolving character going forward, but for right now, she's just okay. Now, while I don't think Fight Girl Season 1 has a bad episode, some episodes are more fun to watch than others, and Episode 8 has to be the blandest episode of the season. Now again, it's not a bad episode, but it just feels like set up the episode, introducing us to characters and plot points that'll be important either in the season finale or the next season. Again, it's not a bad idea, but the execution did leave a bit to be desired. But again, all of these sorts of problems, small as they are, will probably be addressed in Season 2. That is, if this show is even going to be getting a Season 2, which finally leads to my last point. This show's treatment by Cartoon Network and the higher-ups. As I said before, this is a Cartoon Network Studios production, but I'm pretty sure most casuals didn't know that unless they stayed around for the credits to see the copyright and the logo. And despite this being a Cartoon Network original, it's not airing where you expect it to be airing, cause this show is actually airing on Adult Swim / Toonami of all places. Funnily enough, taking My Hero Academia's time slot, which is ironic. Initially, IFG was produced as a Cartoon Network original series meant to air on the main channel, or at least Cartoon Network Daytime as I'll call it. This was the case for multiple years until a few months before its release, where it was announced that it was coming to Adult Swim instead of Cartoon Network, making this the third case of a show that was originally meant to air on Cartoon Network but was moved to Adult Swim. The previous ones being Unicorn Warriors Eternal and My Adventures with Superman if you needed a refresher. Now for Unicorn Warriors Eternal, I could kinda understand that being moved to Adult Swim since Gennady had basically made Adult Swim his home thanks to Samurai Jack Season 5 and Primal. And his last show on Cartoon Network was Symbionic Titan, which was cancelled, aired in 2010, and was written off for taxes. So the underlying decision made some sense. But for Superman and IFG, I don't really see the reason for putting these on Adult Swim. And it just goes to show how much of a mess the current state of Cartoon Network actually is. Cause if this did air on Cartoon Network as intended, I think it could have been a good sign to show to people that Cartoon Network can still make good shows that bring attention. But of course, we don't live in that universe. And for now it seems that Iyanu Child of Wonder show is going to be doing just that. And while I have watched a few clips of it and seen the trailer, I'm gonna be honest, I'm not super interested in it. Now my opinion could change and the show hasn't aired yet, but that's just how I feel right now. But what makes it a little worse is that Adult Swim didn't really do much to promote Invincible Fight Girl, at least in my opinion. Yeah, they had some TV spots, a trailer, and some social media posts, and the decision to have these episode previews of newer episodes was a decent idea, along with temporarily having the first episode for free on YouTube, which I'll admit did get some decent views. But outside of that, Adult Swim didn't really do too much. And as a fan of the show who wants to see it continue, and to be honest, just wants to see Cartoon Network get a proverbial W for once, I don't think it's gonna happen. You also have to remember that this is a new IP, so you know how companies like to treat these. Throwing them into the deep end, watching them drown, and then being surprised when they don't succeed. Nobody wants to nurture new IPs anymore. They just want them to be successful from the beginning when that's never really always the case. Now a slight sliver of hope is that the series premiere made it the most popular show on Adult Swim, and if the ratings are to be believed, the show did have some consistent viewership, with episodes 3 and 4 being around 220k respectively, actually gaining in viewership for a bit. So there is a chance it could be renewed for another season, but at the time I'm recording this, it's the middle of February and the first season ended in late December. So the silence is personally concerning. I want us to get a second season not only because the show itself has many teasers for future conflicts, but also, I think the creative team behind the show would freaking cook. Both the creator and one of the main writers for this series have worked on pretty good shows, like DC Superhero Girls and Gen 4 My Little Pony. One of the directors, Alan Wan, worked on pretty much every animated TMNT project since 2003. And one of the storyboard artists on the season was Kevin Molina Ortiz, who is an absolute storyboarding god and got rewarded for it. This show has some talented people on it, and I want to see that talent given a second chance with this show. So yeah, Invincible Fight Girl is good. It's not a mind-blowing show, and if you watched a lot of shonen anime, the series might feel very derivative, but the show does have heart, and I think that's what matters most. But anyway, yeah, like, subscribe, comment, whatever. I'll see you in the next video. And yeah, I crossed 15 minutes.